The emission lines for each element contained in the database can be displayed. So if for now we just select copper, selecting this button in the toolbar will display vertical lines corresponding to the wavelengths and intensities of the database emission lines for the selected elements and ionization states. The length of each line is scaled to the relative intensity for the emission line as listed in the database. If the Annotate NIST lines checkbox is ticked, then the lines will also be annotated with the details of the lines that they represent. So we can see the element, ionization state, wavelength and relative intensity. Note that for clarity, only a certain number of the most intense lines for each element and ionization state are annotated. To view the annotations for less intense database lines, zoom in to the relevant section of the spectrum. If a spectrum under analysis is currently displayed, clear this for a second. So if we load that copper spectrum that we were using before, the database lines are overlaid on that spectrum. In this case, any peak annotations will be temporarily hidden while the database lines are displayed, but will be redisplayed when the database lines are hidden. So if there were any peak markers, they would be redisplayed then. This tool provides a powerful visual way to compare the position of the spectrum peaks with the emission lines in the database, helping the user in the identification of the peaks. For example, if we zoom in on this spectrum between 215 nanometers and 225 nanometers, and then overlay the copper emission lines from a database as before, we can see that many of the emission lines displayed correspond to the peaks in the spectrum. It is also possible to scale the database emission lines. If we right-click on the first ionic copper lines in the plot legend and set the scale factor at 40%, then the corresponding emission lines are scaled accordingly and match more closely the intensity of the peaks in the spectrum. Emission lines in the database with low relative intensities can also be filtered from the display by increasing the minimum intensity setting in the peak ID configuration window. So if we set a minimum intensity value of 500, any emission line with a relative intensity of less than 500 has now been removed from the display.